Deputy Speaker. I'll say at the outset that I support the bill. It makes a series of sensible administrative changes to an important long-standing scheme, the Export Market Development Grant Scheme, which is actually a Whitlam government scheme from 1974. I'm only 1 year older than this scheme, and it's certainly stood the test of time. Now, these changes, the independent review, I might stress these are not the government's ideas. They haven't come up with these ideas. They quite sensibly had an independent review, spoke to hundreds of businesses and took that expert advice. And the review found that the policy intent of the scheme has stood the test of time. For over 40 years, this scheme that the Whitlam Labor government introduced is still a sound piece of policy. But as you'd expect, there's a range of changes as the economy changes, as the nature of our markets and exporters change, so must the scheme change in an administrative sense. So the idea of having upfront payments to provide greater certainty to businesses is a sensible one. In a past life, I used to actually work in the Victorian government in trade and investment. I've run trade missions around the world. I've spoken to businesses and tried to help them in the Victorian context, and there was a lot of frustration with this scheme that people couldn't actually run a cash flow on it or bank on it. They had no idea what they were going to get. It was like a little lottery that they might win or they might lose. They've lowered the threshold, which is a controversial recommendation in some senses, but it does, so the government says, and the review said, better target the available dollars to SMEs, so by lowering the cap from 50 million to 20 million and creating two streams, businesses new to export and those wanting to expand export. So that's all sensible as far as it goes. But I do want to turn my remarks to the second reading amendment. Listening to the previous speaker, he said, we're doing well as a nation in trade. Self-congratulatory prattle from the government. I mean, he's obviously content-rich, but I can see why Christopher Pyne sent him here. It's so we miss Christopher. He's certainly an antidote, if you like, to my insomnia. I was thinking of getting a podcast. But there is a serious and growing crisis. There's a serious and growing crisis, government. I mean, the self-congratulatory prattle, oh, everything's fine in trade, there's nothing to worry about. It's almost like there's not a trade crisis. It's almost like there's not 80 ships sitting off the coast of China with over $1 billion of our export just sitting there going nowhere. I mean, the Prime Minister's comeback slogan, we could apply them to the ships, couldn't we? Come back, ships, they don't want you. We've stuffed up the relationship so badly, come back, we'll do something else. I mean, it's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Mogadon speaker after government muppet gets up and says, oh, we're doing really well on trade, it's all going swimmingly, it's all tickety-boo. Well, it's not. It's not. Have a look at the facts under this government in your 8th year, the 8th year of this government. 3 key metrics. SMEs. 14% of our nation's trade, our exports, are from SMEs. Compare that to the G7 nations, 25%. Or the European Union average, 35%. The government's fiddling with a Whitlam government scheme. The amount of funding, though, matters in the scheme. You haven't put enough funding into it. 8th year in government. You put, I think, another, was it $37 million as a COVID boost. Panic, panic, let's put some money in the scheme. All of a sudden we can spend money. The funding was $240 million. When Paul Keating left office, it was $270 million. 23 years ago. There was vastly more money in real terms in this scheme. And the government's fiddling the little administrivia rules saying, oh, haven't we done a good job? The spin versus the reality from this government, it's a marketing department masquerading as a government. There's nothing serious happening over there. Just another announcement. Oh, look, we've announced, we've changed the rules in the scheme that the Whitlam government introduced, but have a look at the outcomes. 14% of our trade exports are from SMEs. It's not good enough. Have a look at our export complexity. We have a serious problem under this government with our export complexity. Our exports, our trade, are far too narrowly focused and concentrated on a very few things that we export. So, of course, the headline figure for trade's gone up because people are buying this year a whole lot more of our iron ore. But if you take that out of it, we're not doing well. That comes, that goes. The headline figures that the government's trumpeting disguise a serious underlying problem with our trade and export profile. They haven't done anything about it. They just love making announcements. We are too dependent on a small number of exports. This is not a new problem. It's not an easy problem to fix, but we don't value add enough. We're now 93rd in the world for trade export complexity, 93rd in the world, behind Kazakhstan, behind Uganda, behind Senegal. I mean, that's not good enough. We're an advanced OECD economy, the 13th largest economy in the world, and we are far too dependent on a very narrow slice very narrow slice. There's no single solution, but there is a role for government, a much more creative, thoughtful role for government in industry and trade policy than we've seen over here. All they want to do is cut things. That's all they want to do. You have a look at market diversification. I mean, that's the big one, isn't it? That's the big one at the moment, market diversification. Well, their 8th year in government, all of a sudden they're running around going, oh, well, we need to diversify away from China. I mean, this is a new thing. Look what we discovered. It's not a new thing. People have been talking about this age of disruption between our biggest security partner and our biggest economic partner for years. If you talk to the experts, if you talk to business, if you talk to the academics, if you listen to your own bureaucrats for the government, they'd be saying, amber light flashing. We have a market concentration problem here. But you need to do more than just say diversify. They actually need to do something. So how's it working out, all the talk about diversification? Well, not very well. Like I said, we've got 80 Australian ships. Well, they're not Australian, got rid of the shipping industry, but 80 ships with Australian coal sitting off the coast of China with over $1 billion of our product, not welcome, not let in. As I said, the comeback slogan, come back ships, come back to shore, come back to Australia. We've stuffed the relationship, they won't let you in. I mean, the Prime Minister, he's got that little thing. Remember we saw after he stopped the boats, he was the Immigration Minister, he stopped the boats, he's got that little ship sitting on his desk. I stopped the boats. Well, Xi Jinping will need a whole new palace to put all the boats of Australian exports that he's stopped. I mean, this is a serious matter. This is a serious relationship. The threats to our trade relationships are deadly serious. And of course our sovereignty and our values must come first. But it's been crystal clear for years under this do-nothing government that we may face this situation. And now the government just looks confused. Just confused. It's as if we didn't have the former Prime Minister running around gratuitously insulting our biggest trading partner with, oh, Shanghai Sam. It's as if domestic politics at every turn for the Liberal Party, and particularly this Prime Minister who's very, very good at politics. I mean, you've got to hand him that. Very, very good at politics. But it's as if every time it matters in the national interest, domestic politics doesn't trump the national interest. We found out shockingly the Foreign Minister made the announcement about the World Health Organisation, which was widely panned by the national security establishment, didn't have to go and poke our biggest trading partner in the eye. We could have been more diplomatic. We could have said, as Kevin Rudd observed, how about we do a study? How you frame stuff matters. How you talk to people matters. Absolutely. Absolutely. We could have got the same outcome. Look at the smug little whippet over there. I mean, we missed. What did you do to the previous member? We know about your loyalty. We know about your loyalty and what happened. Unbelievable.
Order. I ask the member to withdraw that comment.
Oh, I withdraw that comment. Withdraw that comment. But it's a serious business. It's a serious business. It's been clear for 4 years. There's no strategy. There's no trade minister. The previous finance minister announced in July that he was going. The Prime Minister's known for 5 months he's going to have to get a cabinet reshuffle underway. He's now downgraded the trade portfolio in the middle of a trade crisis, downgraded it and put it under the finance minister and under the Senate leader. Well, I wonder when Australian exporters are going to get a trade minister who might actually focus on this growing crisis. We've got backbenchers running foreign policy. The foreign minister is so weak, as I was saying before, she went on Insiders and announced the World Health Organisation investigation because she needed an announcement. I mean, you couldn't actually just go on television for the morning and talk about your agenda or manage the foreign policy debate or talk about what the government's doing or achieving. We needed to make up an announcement. Well, how well that has gone for us. How well that has gone for us. Not one single minister in this government can pick up the phone in the last 2 years and call any of their counterparts in our biggest trading partner. I mean, what a stunning success that's been. Well done, government. No relationship at all. And the foreign minister's so weak, she's outsourced foreign policy to a bunch of the extreme backbenchers. They're the ones popping up on TV, trotting out the messages, mucking up the relationship. We've had private briefings, I won't say from whom, but from former heads at the very top of the government, people who've served Labor and Liberal government from the national security establishment, who have been scathing about the way the government has managed this. They have observed that the World Health Organisation, chest-beating call from the front, no diplomacy, was not in our national interest, that it undermined our national security. And one thing they said to us very clearly, which I've tried to take to heart when I go out and talk on TV, is that this relationship should be managed by adults, by the Prime Minister, by the Foreign Minister, by the Opposition Leader and the Shadow Foreign Minister, and just about everyone else should shut up. If only the Foreign Minister and the government had the strength to call these nutters in the government into line and stop running out and trotting out their lines, this country would be in a much better place, a much better place. Now, as I said, diversification isn't easy, but the government had the best opportunity, a serious opportunity, to look at diversification, which was the Varghese report from 2018 on India. 2018 on India. The former head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade did a serious piece of work, $1.5 million study into how we could diversify our trade relations with India. And what did that say? It said there's no single market over the next 20 years that offers more growth opportunities for Australia than India. Not one. Recommendations, and the Prime Minister said in 2018, well, the government endorses the report and provides in principle support to its 20 priority recommendations. Great announcement. We're going to diversify trade with India. Great opportunity. That's what we're going to do. Well, what's happened 2 years on? Nothing. The government's implemented one recommendation out of 20 and they've wandered away from the rest. They've opened a new consul generate in Kolkata. That's it. That's all they've done. All this opportunity out there, all this need to diversify our trade relations. The government had the report, they loved the announcement, but they never deliver. Yet another example of this government addicted to the announcement, addicted to the marketing. Prime Minister loves taking photos of himself. You know, he could have taken a trade advisor into his 2 weeks quarantine in the lodge. Could have taken his trade advisor, his chief economics advisor or chief scientist, maybe learnt something, but no. He took his personal photographer and subjected us all to photos of himself wandering around in shorts. It's a joke. It's not a serious government, it's a marketing department. Spin, delivery, no outcome. As I said, the government has no plan for trade, no plan to diversify trade, no plan for jobs, no serious structural reform in the budget. They managed to spend $98 billion of new spending, run up over $1 trillion of Liberal Party debt, nothing to show for it, not one serious piece of structural economic reform, and what we get in the middle of a trade crisis is a bill from the government to change the rules in a scheme the Whitlam government introduced 46 years ago. Unbelievable. We heard in question time today, we had the Education Minister, he wandered up and he was doing his audition, wasn't he? He wants to be the next Trade Minister. We read that in the Fin Review, we'll see what happens Friday. But he was doing his audition and he regaled us with figures and statistics and he said, we're working on more free trade agreements. Well, whoop-de-doo. Whoop-de-doo. Anyone who knows anything about trade policy knows we want global agreements and we want regional agreements, and bilateral agreements can sometimes achieve something and often they make things more confusing. There's been no honest auditing of all these free trade agreements they love to announce. No one knows whether the outcomes are achieved. They just jump onto the next one and make another announcement. What about the hard work of the behind-the-border barriers, of the non-tariff barriers? The government actually goes and talks to exporters instead of reading out their little talking points they get. They would understand that the biggest barriers for most exporters are not the tariffs anymore in most of our markets. That's not the barrier. It's the non-tariff barriers, the customs regulations, the extra checks, the standards, the cultural barriers. They're the things which the government needs to focus on instead of trying to think up their next announcement to get another free trade agreement. And look, finally, I'll just share a word, I suppose, in the last minute for international education, our fourth biggest export sector, and indeed my state of Victoria's single largest export sector. Can you imagine the Prime Minister talking about any other export sector the way he has about international education? Go home. He said to students, if you don't like it, go home. To a sector worth $40 billion to our country. $40 billion, a sector which relies on word-of-mouth marketing. We know that from the research. This is a sector with a 12-month, 6-month pipeline. Students who are here, if they feel welcome and they have a good experience, they put it on social media and tell their family and friends and more comes. How do you think the students felt being told by the national leader to go home? I spoke to the CEO of one of the accommodation providers who said the morning after he had students at his front desk saying, well, I need to leave, where are the forms to leave because the Prime Minister told us to go home. They heard that literally. How do you think they felt? The government's taken no responsibility for helping our fourth biggest export sector. Indeed, I know the Minister for Education, he tried. He hasn't called his counterpart in China for 2 years, but he did take some things to Cabinet, but he gets rolled every time by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. I genuinely don't understand why the Prime Minister is hostile to international education. Remember a couple of years ago he said, oh, if you can't get a seat on the bus or can't get a lane to drive your car in, it's because of all the international students. I mean, unbelievable. The government has no credibility on trade. They cannot say they're serious on trade. And if this is the extent of reform, in the middle of a trade crisis, then God help us.